Hello, everybody. President Sunday here. I am joined today by Djalma Beorn, who is a philosopher, an adventurer, a seducer of women, and you can
Oh my
go into
God.
more detail if you like.
I can't possibly best that introduction except to completely destroy it by saying that I'm a PhD student in philosophy who's primarily studying history of philosophy and metaphysics. So that just sends all that to hell. Yeah. So hi, everyone.
So just in terms of format, so with respect to this topic, I'm obviously a political scientist. I probably know as much as any of you, maybe a bit less. So I'm largely going to keep quiet while Djalma does his spiel. If any of you have questions or are finding any of this confusing, what have you, I'm going to be watching the chat, and if there is a point needing clarification, I will stop Djalma, and we will go into some. We'll try to go to some length to clarifying that, also for my edification as well, because again, this is entirely new for me. I have never studied metaphysics formally, much less eugenics, so I'm actually looking forward to this for my own learning as well. So if you want to begin, if you're comfortable with that, we can just get right into it.
So to kind of like go over just the contours of my knowledge base and the areas that I'm, competent in versus have an expertise in. Again, like I am a philosopher, I have historically gone into discussions around eugenics, history of eugenics, kind of especially where people don't expect to see it. So a lot of stuff about history of eugenics in Western Canada. And, with obviously a more progressive eye towards kind of what it's brought on and kind of what it's wrought. The difficulty with these really ideological topics like eugenics is that many different traditions tend to feed into them. So I'm approaching it from one possible angle. And again, this is more sort of a set of suggestions for how we can interpret a history that has eventually fed into eugenics, more so than this is it, guys. Like, eugenics is reducible to naturalism, which I'll course define, or that it began, with Darwin in the late 19th century and it's got, no other roots than that. So we're trying to just sort of pinpoint maybe one possible angle on this. And so the idea was I would go through that and then eventually see how it's kind of created a metaphysical or the conception of the world. And what that basically means is eugenics has painted for us an idea through naturalism, which is basically that things are the way they are because they're found that way in nature, bluntly. There's many fancy explanations. That's the pretty much go-to explanation. So it paints a picture of what the nature of being is, which is more closely ontology than metaphysics, but it's all kind of getting into the nature of things in the world and being. And eventually what I want to do is I want to say that, these ideas that we have about the nature of the world or being are not as well founded or well structured as we necessarily think they are. And there's certain philosophers, particularly philosophers of science, people don't normally think of, who actually undo a lot of these conceptions really effectively with more nuanced, careful ideas about how we ought to learn about the world, replacing really metaphysics with epistemology. So what we claim we can know with what things are versus like what we can claim to know about them. So it's a jaunt through the history of eugenics. Aren't you all lucky? And then linking that into metaphysics from there. Does that kind of make sense as a general trajectory?
I think that was pretty clear. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, chat, does anybody, I see we've only got like 6 people watching us, so it's a pretty small audience at the moment, which is fine by me. Is any of this confusing to you? Is there any parts of the itinerary that you'd like clarified, or are we good to go? Because I think you've got quite a thing sort of prepared. So that's, yeah, so that should be fine. So chat,
okay.
We're going to give you 10 seconds.
Oh, wow. This is why I don't want to play chess while I'm doing this, because we'll show how sloppy my thinking actually is, as I fail horribly, as I do when I play against you. So, yeah, the only time I fail.
Yeah, Djalma refused to play a game of chess during this, and for good reason.
He's a mastermind. This is the true sign. If we really were very good at it, though, and if he was actually as good as he claims, we'd probably be, announcing it like knight to c5 or whatever nerdy bullshit they tend to engage in that way.
No, I don't want that kind of attention.
No, okay, so basically what we're looking at when we're looking at the history of eugenics is we're looking at a movement that believes that human beings can control their destiny by controlling their reproductive options. So what this means is it's an extension of the idea that So it's a very liberal idea. It's a very humanistic idea. And at its core is basically that we have the power to generate new possibilities for ourselves based on controlling factors. Otherwise, we would say we're in God's hands. And so, of course, it relates very immediately into things like evolutionary psychology, into naturalism and all the rest of it. So going back all the way to the 19th century, at the time, there was a really big battle between sort of like the ends of philosophical modernism were at place. There was a battle between sort of philosophy and empiricism, this sort of new emerging scientific way of looking at the universe that was starting to characterize the academy and other places, that basically believed that everything that we can learn about ourselves can be learned either empirically through our senses, or at minimum can be kind of like deduced from our surroundings. Now, the difficulty with a lot of this kind of scientific rhetoric and thinking was that people weren't critically investigating the background claims that worked into what they were saying. So, for instance, we have, Charles Darwin, who is a very legendary biologist and thinker. A zoologist. And so the thing about Charles Darwin is he's kind of put as sort of the father of modern science in some way. And this is, so he's a naturalist, which is a little bit of what we call a tautology, because really naturalism came from him. And he's a geologist and a biologist, and he's known for his contributions to the science of evolution. And this is basically kind of the way that we frame Darwin. And Darwin's often contrasted to kind of these sort of religious, scholastic thinkers of centuries prior, insofar as Darwin is really interested in looking at human behaviors via what he calls natural and sexual selection. So in other words, wants to look at how we become what we're like through this kind of teleological argument, or argument from first cause, where that first cause is a species going in and either optimizing its chances of survival via who individual species members mate with, or optimizing their survival by becoming ideally adapted to their environment. And of course, this differs wildly from the kind of arguments prior to this that involve the centrality of God and making us who we are, giving us the spirit that we have, contributing our essence to us. Except when you go back a step further, what you realize is that Darwin is making this entire case on a certain reading for the sake of trying to triumph or centralize the rationality of man. And the rationality of man is this kind of God-given quality, as he framed it, that can't be reduced to either the process of selection, sexually or naturally. We have this ability to be metacognizant of ourselves. And this is something that finds its root in things like the Great Chain of Being. People are probably very familiar with that, where there's this chain that has man at the top, actually very specifically man, because women are seen as being in between men and the higher animals, which is, of course, problematic in all kinds of ways.
I'm going to put a picture of that up on the screen.
Yeah, so the Great Chain of Being, there's a lot of lovely kind of weird late 19th century illustrations of this. And there's a sense in which human beings are at the top of the Great Chain of Being because they most resemble God. Now, how do they most resemble God? They are reasoning animals. They are capable, and this is actually an idea that gets carried through even in the opposition to these movements. They're capable of thinking through their own existence on a meta level, such that they're able to make decisions that are in their best interests, and they're able to analyze their behavior on a higher level. And so the upshot of all this for Darwin was that, okay, if we know that species develop the way they do via a process of natural and sexual selection, that human beings on a rational level should be able to control this process. We should become these creatures of rational feeling, the sort of embodied images of God in the world, such that we're able to say what we do and we don't want for ourselves. Now, as with any high-flying, potentially grandiose idea that people have come up with historically, it ends up manifesting in the most cruel, insidious, horrible and violent ways in a lot of regards. And to be deadly clear, I am deeply opposed to the practice of eugenics. And I think it's really created the foundation for a lot of horribly problematic stuff in the 20th century and for our own misunderstanding. So of course we botched this terribly. But what we decide going forward is that at the time of the we being sort of, I guess, I shouldn't say we because it doesn't really involve me, but Europeans decide going forward that ultimately, we ought to then programmatically think about who should reproduce. Now, this is the point in the scientific process where the value judgments come in. And one thing that people make about empirical and scientific judgments is that they don't have what we would call a normative or evaluative component. And this normative or evaluative component is basically the statement that we should do something. Some of you may be familiar with the notion of is ought in philosophy. Historically, philosophical ideas that tend to be more naturalistic are ideas that are this is the way it is, and therefore it ought to be this way. And this is kind of a fallacy in some senses.
Or
because,
maybe just for clarification's sake, another way of putting it is simply using what is as the basis of an ought statement. So, for example, it's not uncommon to see, for example, in debates over between theists and atheists on homosexuality, often it's pointed to the fact that homosexuality occurs in nature. Well, this is true, but it doesn't have prescriptive value would be the point. That's not making a stance on that argument, to be clear. I'm just using that as an example. But that's
exactly, and that's a good way of putting it. And as with eugenics, naturalism has a very confused and lengthy and kind of bizarre and equivocated history. So basically, what we're doing, we're looking at this whole tradition, how it eventually developed, is we're looking at kind of people engaging in a naturalistic fallacy. This is actually a pretty good segue back into the main point, which is the is-ought divide is really the divide that characterizes the naturalistic fallacy. And so what do I mean by this? I mean, okay, going back to our previous depiction, we know that sexual and natural selection fit into how species develop the way they are. We have this weird sort of human exceptionalism whereby we reflect the nature of God due to our unique possession of a type of reasoning capacity that we share with God that other animals don't possess. And so what people would conclude from this is that, well, then we have a right to control the way in which we reproduce or what we find allowable in context in terms of reproduction, because we are a certain type of being. It's the nature of what we're like that we're ultimately rational animals. This goes all the way back to Aristotle. And as a result, we should be able to make these kinds of judgment calls about ourselves. Now, if only that's where it ended, because what we're describing there, when you think about it, is the methodology or the method we use to make these judgment calls. What we're actually doing is we're actually using probably not reason at all, but something that a philosopher of science, Charles Saunders Peirce, who I'll be getting into later as someone who countered the naturalism movement indirectly in his work, would call logica utens. And what that means is our sort of intuition or common belief or reason. So what we're doing is we're saying, I don't like this type of person. They don't fit into whatever rubric or frame or scheme I think is desirable, I think is something I would want to attain for myself. Therefore, I'm going to reduce the opportunity, if I have the power to allow that person to reproduce. So you see the difference there. Yeah, so like on the one hand, we're talking about the method, the idea that we ought to pursue our nature as rational beings and optimizing our existence, and we're also these natural beings, and so it makes sense for us to do it, and that's one statement. But then how we go about doing that doesn't really use a lot of reason. It uses a lot of intuition. And so this is how you get some very bizarre things that surface from that. And the thing about eugenics that people tend to get very, very wrong is that it's uniquely played into these horrific movements like Nazism or these kind of like totalitarian ideologies that emerge from that period, when in reality, eugenic thinking undergirds a lot of thinking about social categories that we now have. So one such example is seen in the work of 19th century psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing in his...
Here, hold on a second there, Djalma. Just come in a little bit closer to the mic.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're doing good. Just I was detecting a slight decline in volume, but you're doing good.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. I'm using only the most advanced equipment, obviously. So as PhD students tend to. So yeah, so basically to get right into it, then the 19th century psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing, in his main psychiatric text, Psychopathia Sexualis, which is of course the most inappropriately named thing ever now, talks about this category of inversion. So when we're dealing with eugenics, when we're dealing with the idea of controlling reproductively, who's allowed to reproduce, who fits into what category, blah, blah, there's a few different types of people that people tend to consider. It's not just this racial rhetoric. It also tends to be applied to people who we would now consider LGBTQ or sexual minorities. And that's through this idea of like the invert. So it's unclear whether, and the reason I'm bringing this example up, to be totally clear, is because I'm trying to illustrate how eugenic rhetoric is not always straightforwardly evil, but gets really, really convoluted. And as is the case with a lot of ideological things that are turned to very evil ends, they start out as nice sentiments about man being a rational animal, us being able to control our destiny, figuring out through evolution and scientific method what kind of beings we are. They start and trying to help people potentially. So the long story short with the invert is that Crafty Bing says, there are these two types of inverts. And what an invert is the sort of prototype of person. Sorry, I see what you mean about talking on streams. You get really dry throat.
Right? Your mouth dries up and you're just
it does. It does. You end up especially in extreme heat that we are now finally experiencing.
I talk way less than you too, so I mean, you're doing great.
So I'm talking to Blue Streak here. But yeah, so basically you get this idea of the invert as somebody who is basically not, it's actually the specific definition of a normal person in the 19th century is very, very bizarre. You have to, first of all, pardon me for getting immediately kind of dank, so to speak, with this. You have to, first of all, never masturbate. You must save all of your sexual desire for the opposite sex and then try to dull it as much as possible, except in the immediate procreative act with the opposite sex, which will happen in your youth at the appropriate time. And aside from that, you must be absolutely careful to avoid any distractions or things that would lead to an immoderate life. And that is the figure that is non-inverted. Anybody else who does everything from what we would call be trans today, be gay, masturbate, anything is considered to be an invert. And you see how the scientific rhetoric dovetails perfectly on a lot of the Christian morality of that same period, similar to what we see in Darwin. I mean, keep in mind that Darwin's project is aimed at glorifying God, glorifying us as these rational beings that have these godlike capacities. Not in a sacrilegious way, but saying that we really are God's children, and us in particular.
Can we stop on that point for just 5 seconds?
Yes.
That is a really interesting divergence from the popular view of Darwin as being almost like the quintessentially atheist modern text.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit about that? Do you have, like, off the top of your head? I know it's a really complex topic, but
it is.
What is Darwin's, like, in very broad strokes? Like, what is Darwin's relationship with that religion?
So here's the thing: the proof that I'm not bullshitting you, basically, is that there's a particular passage in Darwin where he contends with this, where he's like, "Look, you're supposed to be a Christian man. I can't believe a Christian man of good feeling, who studied the ancients, who understands the importance of Aristotle, understands the importance of care and discretion in human behavior, could say such a violent thing about us, could debase us in this way." And he's like, actually, that's not true. I consider man to be a uniquely rational animal. And this cannot be reduced to any of the methodologies I've employed previously to discuss the ways in which we resemble the lower creatures in our, evolutionary or sexual capacities. And so he actually directly answers this and says, no, in fact, I consider us to be unique and consider my project. And he does this partially to save himself because he wants people to have uptake. So who knows how sincere versus how political he actually was in doing this. But he wants people to have uptake. And so basically what he does is he says, yeah, I think we're utterly unique. And I think that we are non-reducible to these other types of entities. And how much more rational do we seem and how much more human do we seem that we have these qualities that I can't account for? Mm-hmm. So I can give you the passage. I can put it up at the end of the stream, but he directly responds to this. So it's very bizarre that people don't pick up on this. It's almost like in defiance of reading him, they refuse to pick up on this.
Well, I mean, it's sort of like Marx and the Marxists, right? Like, there wasn't sort of popular understanding of what a Darwinian was prior to Darwin, and not even during Darwin's life. It's actually a fairly recent thing that we tend to think of the Darwinian as. I mean, you almost see a combination of the Darwinian and the Nietzschean as if these were in any way, shape, or form the same kind of thing.
I know, but so opposite, hey? I mean, you know what they're getting at? They're getting
explicitly opposite. Yeah. Go on, please.
But they're reducing it to the sort of simple notion that we can control our destiny. That somehow the Ubermensch is similar to the ultimately rational man who can control his own sexual and natural outcomes. Like, it's this idea of control that they're focusing on, because there's this assumption that when we're engaging, so prior to the Cartesian turn, which is basically the turn towards assuming that the world can be understood best through our own minds, as opposed to in a sort of externalized, almost like obsessive topography. There's this type of thing and this type of thing and this type of thing. The Cartesian turn basically leads people to assume on a number of levels that the most important thing in any well-held philosophical view or anything that's worth championing is that it's somehow mind dependent, it's somehow within our control, it somehow exercises our reason. So I'd say that mashing in Nietzsche and Darwin is the result of fetishizing the idea of reason and control and sort of mind dependence over other types of more externalized metaphysics or more essential metaphysics that look at the external world. So it's to do with the fetishization of like a post-Cartesian empiricist rational world, basically, right? And you see this, actually, it's funny, in the Victorian period, you see this reach its zenith in the Sherlock Holmes novels, because the whole, up until about, what is it, like 1870 or so, you would have these novels that would interface with what a lot of literary scholars call like the sublime. Yeah. So this thing so we have the Humean idea that everything that we engage in requires the imagination to interface and have it make sense to us. And in contrast to that, and I think you might have encountered the same scholar I did who discussed Reid and was very obsessed with Reid, had this idea that there's some things that just hit you. You have no blueprint, as it were, for understanding them, and you can't understand them through the course of logical entailment. They just strike you. They strike you in the back of your consciousness, so to speak, right? Yeah. And so if you go on this kind of Reidian as opposed to Humean worldview, what you end up deriving from that is this idea that we can't always put within our purview or control everything that reason would normally allow us to understand. And that, in fact, there's some sort of phenomenology that undergirds things instead of this kind of careful adjudication process that occurs at the core of what we do, right? And I kind of lost my original train of thought, but that will like substitute probably just as effectively.
Where, do you know where we left off originally on this divergence? We were talking about Darwin.
Yeah, and so basically, like, the reason why we got into this whole divergence is basically when you're dealing with Darwin, when you're dealing with Nietzsche, when you're talking about any of these figures, they're glorified as being reasonable because they allow us to see ourselves as having a kind of control that we don't necessarily have, that isn't necessarily part of our phenomenological experience. Like, in other words, the way we interface with the world. Yeah. And the control is seen as exhibiting reason. And what I'm trying to note, and what eventually this other philosopher Peirce will be noting, is that we can't actually use reason like that. We don't actually use reason in ordinary thinking. We use intuition, right? Or we base our notions of things off of these phenomena that we kind of cultivate maybe through the process of reason, but that's not where it originally comes from. So the bottom takeaway of all of this is that don't trust what you think to the level that you think you should. Like, really, really don't bank on what you think as much as you are. And in addition to that, don't assume that what you think is value free or is based on a careful analysis of the world, when it in fact might have. In fact, it will. We're all idiots to some extent. It will have these hidden prejudices. So that's kind of like how all that links in. But I did want to get into this one thing about Krafft-Ebing, just because I think it's a good example of how it's not always just straightforwardly us being prejudiced versus us not being prejudiced. It can get actually kind of winding, right? Yeah. So in Psychopathia Sexualis, he describes the invert as somebody who basically is just like congenitally unable to fit into this narrow Christian notion of kind of being a super huge virgin and never masturbating and then having sex once and it's perfect, right? Yeah. And he manages to realize, and he gets very annoyed because he finally encounters this person named Count Sandor. And the invert to him is mentally deranged. And you actually see a lot of people, psychiatrists in the period right after that, seek out people who we would call schizophrenic and who also happen to exhibit gender nonconforming behavior at the same time. And then kind of like create these post hoc accounts of how they're exhibiting both when they've actually sought out subjects who exhibit both uniquely to make the case.
Just for those who didn't catch that, sorry, Count Sandor?
Count Sandor. And Count Sandor is like the nemesis of Krafft-Ebing, basically because Count Sandor is a sublimely educated, quotes, noble woman who finds herself having inverted feelings of being a man and being attracted to women and being attracted, God forbid, to other inverted women. In other words, people who started as male nominally and became female later on, and has all these female lovers, some of which are basically trans women. And like Kraft-Ebing cannot handle this person because they're not out to lunch, bluntly. Like, I know it's a horrible way of putting it, I shouldn't say it that way, but they're not, there's nothing that would classify them as schizophrenic per se. And it's kind of insulting to both people who are schizophrenic and people who are trans to assume that the two go hand in hand when this is something that was deliberately put together. So they're like, well, so what Kraft-Ebing has to assume from Count Sandor is, you know, these homosexual feelings which Count Sandor has are congenital. They're not just acquired.
Yeah.
He believes that everybody can be educated out of inversion by dint of being brought back into the fold and being inculcated in good Christian moral values, which themselves are based in evolutionary psychology. So he invented bounces off
the conversion camp.
He did, actually. Yeah. He literally did. And it goes back, but he also invented the word that became the word trans. So the words themselves come from the same place as the prejudice. That's why there's so much difficulty for trans people now, right? So basically, this idea that you can acquire it and it can be cured is a common idea at that time. And you can cure it basically through, you know, not thinking about things, not masturbating, not encountering gay people. I'm not kidding you. He thinks that merely encountering gay people will actually bring you along this path, as if they kind of infect you with their gayness, which is...
Somehow I imagine he was loath to cite his sources for that.
Well, here's an embarrassing thing about him too, that people who think he's disgusting might enjoy, which is he's a very brilliant man. He dedicated approximately 120 pages of Psychopathia Sexualis to fur fetishism and wore an enormous number of furs. So he could possibly, on a number of levels, have some of his own stuff going on. Yeah, he may actually also be the first furry. This guy is really the father of a lot of things. Hopefully not literally. So basically it's an acquired manifestation. Then he encounters Count Sandor, and he's like, it can't be acquired. This person is clearly a congenital invert and is horrified by this. He's like, you know, you're congenital, you're past help. And Sandor's like, why, thank you. And it's actually the most hilarious exchange between the two of them, because Sandor's like, look, it doesn't help me to dwell on the fact that I'm past help. I've actually had a really excellent life. And your notion of what would help me doesn't actually make sense to me, given that there's no normative value. There's no moral value on it for me. So eventually Havelock Ellis comes along about 30 years later, and he's like, you know what? Maybe some inverts can't help it. Maybe they need surgery to correct their feelings, to make them put their feelings in a line. Havelock Ellis. Yeah. And so Havelock Ellis is like a eugenicist, basically. But a lot of people see him as the father of transsexual surgery. He's kind of both, right? Because what he's saying is that, well, trans people can't help this. And then who is it that invents the word trans? It's after Havelock Ellis. It's, Harry Benjamin, right?
Harry Benjamin.
So Havelock Ellis comes before Harry Benjamin, and he's basically saying, like, look, what if the invert is a natural category? This is getting very Darwinian. What if the invert's a natural category? What if they're just congenital? What if it is the way it is, and that's the way it ought to be? However, because we are rational animals, they don't need to reproduce, do they? And you're like, wait a minute, like you're rescuing the invert by saying that this isn't some abnormal, horrible, criminal, pathological behavior. And you can see Foucault in my thinking a bit here too. Although weirdly, I arrived at this separately from Foucault, which is like my one bragging point in life. And Foucault also looked at this stuff. So it's like a weird, anyway, that's the one good thing I've ever done. But basically something like that. But basically they're not, like, when you look at this, it's like, yeah, it's natural, which is good, but we don't need people to reproduce. And then Harry Benjamin comes along and is like, well, we can correct for this, but, you know, trans people will be sterile. And it's like, wait a minute. That gets just fed into it from the core. And it's like, no, that's just an inadvertent result of getting the transsexual surgery. That's not from the 1950s.
Just to put this in really blunt terms, so kind of fascinating, especially considering current attitudes towards it. The eugenic attitude emerged specifically from the perception that these different kinds of conditions were themselves naturally occurring and not pathological.
Exactly. Isn't that so fucked up? So the eugenics occurred from the naturalistic rhetoric. Well, it's this way, so it ought to be this way. But we ought to also prevent this from occurring, because we ought to have this notion of who should reproduce that doesn't involve these people, because they're abnormal, naturally, of course. So, cheers, let's all exist together. But they are abnormal, so let's not have them reproduce at the same time. And it's like, oh my God, the stuff that's front loaded into this is ridiculous. And then eventually, the long story short is that trans people were like, wait a minute, this is ludicrous. Take back the definition for themselves. Leslie Feinberg, produces a pamphlet in the early 1990s called Transgender Liberation, a movement whose time has come. And they're like, this is ridiculous. Let's not reduce it all to true scum ideology. And then you get the proliferation of things that occur today. So this is how powerful this rhetoric is. This is how powerful it is when we actually take these naturalistic categories and say, this is what kind of being we are. This is what we can do with this. And when we front load our moral and ideological thinking into those categories. So you can imagine my surprise after studying this stuff for like years, and it's more in cultural studies than it is in philosophy. This is sort of going on a huge tangent. Getting into thinking about someone like Peirce, who's saying, oh, you're doing it all wrong because you're front loading these intuitions into your way of reasoning in a way that is so imprecise as to render it meaningless. And none of you are actually doing science right, because you're starting from these naturalistic ideas instead of from phenomenology, instead of from the root source of all of our thinking, which is aesthetics. So he turns the whole thing on its head. Aesthetics, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so he turns the whole thing on its head and like, okay, so who's this random, guy? Who would he be against the naturalistic stream of thinking? Well, he's not only the founder of American pragmatism, but he basically is probably the key thinker that's gone on to influence the entire American academic system since then. So and then on top of that, you'll notice that during this time that Peirce is writing, this may not interest many people, but that's a time when the logical positivists are starting to emerge too. And the positivists are basically people who think that metaphysics has no place in philosophy. They think, and the reason they think this is because they think that, properly speaking, all we can bank on is epistemology through the scientific method. Now, what does that mean? That means we can only bank on what we can know. We can never actually use, as philosopher of science Thomas Nagel would put it, that distal part of our minds to access reality itself. Right. I know that you've had some challenging interactions with people who enjoy the idea of accessing reality itself. Well, that's an absurd notion on any philosopher's view in this day. Right. So they'd be popular.
But just for clarification, in case anybody sort of missed that. So the positivist critique of metaphysics having not critique, but the assertion that metaphysics has no place in philosophy, that's not because there's no content to metaphysics as such, but just because as a domain of study, it's inscrutable.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that we've been improperly positioning it. And now that we have the scientific method, especially, we've been improperly positioning it. And sort of the last bastion in metaphysics on one reading, and again, like I'm getting really loose here, is naturalism, which then became eugenics, is this idea that like, well, it is this way, therefore it ought to be that way. And it is this way because we see it occur in nature and we can track it in a naturalistic setting. Like we can understand it in that context, right? I can't see any of the comments here because the stream. Oh, that's fine.
I think we're just listening intently at this point. I haven't seen any comments from Sean McManus. Suggested that Djalma confirms that NoFap is eugenics incorrectly. By the way, I think the point was that NoFap is eugenics. Yeah. Right.
Let me think. That's actually a hilarious point, Sean. I'm trying to think about that for a second.
The big questions.
Well, I mean, if you assume that all your fapping will automatically lead to an abundance of children, then maybe it is. Usually people are, when they're no fapping, they're trying to kind of like retain self-control. So again, it's our favorite human topic of control, which if we move one step right is going to be, or one step left, pardon my language, would be power.
I'm not sure. I've seen weird accounts of that. So like sometimes it's not even control. Sometimes it's like people think for whatever reason that it like conserves energy or testosterone or something bizarre like that.
This is my view on this. This is like a mini rant. It's basically that it's the same reason people hate emotions. So it's this idea that anything that forces us that, and it almost gets into a little bit of the Arendt stuff that you were talking about previously, which is that we don't want to be enslaved to habits in a specific sense. If we want to be like truly free, agential, actors or something like that. And that's a bit of nonsense in my opinion. Emotions, what are emotions? Well, emotions are rational in some sense, or they're at least intuitive reactions to stimulus, right? And so they have a place in human cognition. Similarly, we live in our bodies. I'm not going to make some kind of loopy point about how, we're reducible to our bodies or anything like that. Well, I'm not a reductionist, but I am going to say that you can get into addictive, problematic behaviors, but those behaviors don't inherently make you less rational or less capable. They just take away energies potentially. And in some cases, they make you more rational or capable because you have to compensate for them. So addiction isn't always it's a net negative thing on a certain reading. And if you want to be a certain type of person, it is. But it's based on that rhetoric that emotion or addiction or things that take us away from our refined rational capacities are intolerable. When in reality, they're often the root of things, right?
Yeah, specifically rational capacities construed as being let's say at their apotheosis as being a state of freedom in particular. So anyways, stay tuned for the future nomos of NoFap coming next month, I'm sure.
I mean, I'm not suggesting we furiously masturbate at all times. This is definitely not what I'm suggesting. I'm just saying that NoFap, anything fits into this rhetoric. I'm, loosely. So, okay, so that was a lot of energy on NoFap. I'm not going to even get into No Nut, which is even more horrifying than NoFap. But
that's a good line to end her on.
So anyway, speaking of NoFap, here's Purse.
Let's go into that because.
So here's a cool tidbit about Purse. Purse is considered in the philosophical world to be the actual original and emblematic Sherlock Holmes figure. Which is because of a couple of reasons. So first of all, how do I describe this? In basing a normative science or a value-filled science on the process of inquiry and understanding things not through their cause, but through their effect and observing them in the world. And then in addition to that, basing his thinking in what we would call phenomenology instead of naturalistic reasoning and facts. Peirce was really.
Oh dear, you've gone silent. Djalma, you've muted yourself. Still with us?
I'm still with you, sorry.
There we go. Did your laptop run out of power or something? Or
no, it's that my very crappy headphones were running out of power.
Okay.
So basically so when you deal with somebody like Peirce, he was really ostracized, and he was ostracized because he hated the way that the academy at the time of the 19th century had turned into this place where gentlemen would gather bluntly to regurgitate knowledge at each other, and he really would frame it in that way, and to basically go over their sort of abundant understanding of various topics, but in the way to have a cultivated conversation, not to actually use a careful process of inquiry to try to determine with a degree of clarity that he believed had not yet been achieved, not the truth of things, but what we could know about things, and via that kind of develop a metaphysics after the fact. And the reason this is significant is that the phenomenology in Peirce, this sort of starting from the root of having an idea about what has value, and then choosing to ignore that in favor of kind of observing the world, was a very different method than going in assuming something was factually the case. So I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Do we want to switch gears into kind of Peirce a little bit?
We can do whatever you like. I think Peirce is interesting just because, again, as you indicated earlier, he goes into, I guess you could say, the mechanisms by which people were led into the kind of fallacious reasoning that was sort of emblemized by these sort of progenitors of eugenics.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just by way of sort of explaining the transition here, that's sort of where we're going with the conversation. But I think you may as well just go into explicating Peirce at this point. I think people kind of
and so basically,
well.
so Peirce was I'm trying to think what I kind of want to give a little biography on him to show why I'm so unbelievably obsessed with him in this kind of disturbing way. I'm joking. I'm not. Okay.
Sure.
No, I am. Like it's fair. I mean, what else are you gonna do in quarantine?
I've started reading him recently. He's a model of clarity. If you can
Yes.
call anybody clear with the amount of math he employs in his writing.
You know how much I enjoy genius, troubled men who are, ostracized because of their own integrity, right?
Is there any way to plug in your earphones and continue using them, because your sound quality was so much better just a second ago? No worries if not.
There may not actually be. In fact, I am charging these crappy earbuds. This is why, if
Okay.
anyone would like to donate to the channel, I could get some better equipment. Given that I'm a
Yes, don't donate to my Patreon to get Djalma better earphones.
yeah. So unfortunately, there isn't. I'm just gonna have to kind of like scream. Okay.
No worries, it's all good.
Is it tolerable? The
Maybe just like speak a little bit more slowly, just in case you cut out a bit, because sometimes it warbles. But otherwise, it seems to be passable. So I wouldn't sweat it too much.
Oh, good. I'm glad it's passable. So basically, yeah. If you go into the biography of Peirce, God, how do we even describe this guy? Like, he has a degree in mathematics. He was very good at chemistry. He was a terrible student. He suffered from like a neuralgic condition that made it impossible for him to participate normally as an intellectual and academic. And he had a really messed up personal life, and that really mattered back then. He left his wife for his mistress, or she left him or something, and that in the end he lost an academic position. And he was, as well as being sick and having what we would call now mental health issues, he was all around just an asshole. So that's why he gets compared to Sherlock Holmes, because they say that if he actually bothered to publish his work, or he had any ability to work through things in the normal way, he would have been like the next Kant. And that's why he's cool to me, because he has this whole like ethical system that comes out of his reasoning that nobody's worked on yet. And I'm hoping to work on a little bit along with some other people. And there's a lot of potential in kind of rescuing him and his work. He influenced pragmatist William James very centrally. And James was a big normie, basically, by comparison. So he was very he knew how to speak. He was good oratorically, and he understood the value of Peirce's work, and he kind of promoted him. And Peirce was weirdly his mentor, so it was very awkward for James when James started getting credited for Peirce's ideas, especially because Peirce is the founder of American pragmatism, which basically is this idea that we can understand things via their causal effects without having to appeal to the truth of anything, right?
Yeah.
So that's the kind of history with Peirce. I actually have to leave for about 2 minutes. Could you maybe fill?
No worries. So let's take a 5-minute intervention. God,
yeah,
a 5-minute intermission so people can go to the washroom.
You don't need an intervention, but yeah, an intermission works just fine.
Sure.
Okay. Right.
All right. So we'll be back in about 5. If anybody has any questions, think of them and write them down, and maybe we'll take some time to go through those when she gets
Yep.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right. Cool. All right. All right. So I'm back. We're just waiting for Djalma now. How are we all doing? Is the audio tolerable? Oh, you're back. Not on your end. My new microphone has still not showed up. I'm very angry about that. It is now 4 days late. And what's that?
That's honestly horrible.
Well, what's annoying isn't that it's late. Like, I can understand that with the pandemic going on. What's annoying is that I'm on Vancouver Island, and it's literally in a warehouse in Vancouver.
Well, that's what happens is like somebody super efficiently gets it across like 10 cities, and then someone's like, I'm just going to sit on this for 14 days. Like, we'll see how it goes.
I've been getting books in just fine as soon as, and I mean, this is not a big package, right? It's a microphone, so it's probably about.
I have things that are sitting in like Shruggy's location right now, which is very close to mine, not to, reveal us both, but that have been sitting there for like 21 days.
Guys, don't let the NRX people know that we're all in Canada.
They don't care about us. I mean, let's be honest. Who cares
I think they already suspected we're all in Canada anyways.
Sunday, based on our accents, I think it's very obvious we're Canadian. We actually have Canadian accents, so yeah. Ain't that the truth,
All right. So before we continue, does anybody have any questions or
hope they're not stunned and silent
comments about my fantastic artwork here? I don't know if Djalma can see that, but I'm quite pleased with it.
I appreciated it.
Good. I'm glad. All right. Well, may as well just continue.
Yeah, nothing like deep diving into some purse when it's 30 degrees and muggy in the middle of summer during quarantine. Like that's what everyone wants to do in quarantine. Okay, so I think we should do that though. And I think we should get at how he derives the maximum pragmatism and what the heck he even means.
Sure.
So how to make our ideas clear. Peirce is one of those thinkers that, like Wittgenstein, his early and his later work are not. Like, early Wittgenstein has nothing in common with later Wittgenstein to the point that you wouldn't even know it was the same thinker. Early Peirce is more baby Peirce. So he's more just kind of bringing his ideas out in the first place, trying to figure out, like, what is wrong with a lot of the ways we approach what he calls inquiry. And then he goes on to sort of apply that or think it through more critically or integrate into philosophical traditions later on. So he's doing this lovely thing that I think more philosophers should do, which is he's living out his philosophy. He's engaging in inquiry about inquiry, which is incredibly neurotic, but it's also very Peirce. So basically, when he talks about how to make our ideas clear, he's getting into the 3 grades of clarity. And the way he frames this has a lot to do with the positivists. So before I went on some massive tangent about 25 minutes ago, I was bringing up the positivists, and I was bringing them up to the point of saying that, look, positivist thinkers do not care about metaphysics. They see metaphysics as being inaccessible, as you said, redundant, inappropriately scientific or mathematical, and as being easily replaced by looking at something via its logical coordinates. So and also the other benefit of positivism on a mathematical register is I can look at very tiny entities, I can look at big entities, I can talk about really esoteric stuff that I have no means of observing, but I can postulate based on kind of figuring out what we know about it and figuring out its coordinates, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where the positivists come from. And a lot of them are just logicians, and Russell is one of them. And Russell frequently gets framed as the actual Sherlock Holmes of philosophy, but the reason he's not is because Sherlock Holmes doesn't care at all about deduction as much as Arthur Conan Doyle tried to frame him that way. What he's doing is engaging in inference. Yeah. And he's brilliant at being an ass and engaging in inference. And I know that you are not a fan of the BBC Sherlock, but I found the BBC Sherlock fascinating. And
No. I'm not a fan of the BBC Moriarty. I really like the BBC Sherlock.
I mean, I basically am Jim from that, so like keep that in mind. So that's why I have to kind of accept that.
Maybe that explains it.
Yeah, it does explain it. Just violent in that way. I'm not an anarchist, though. I promise. So basically, the interesting thing about that is that, like, it explores the trajectory of this man who has an unusual genius in his ability to actually be a person. And it kind of gets into a really harrowing thing where, the one thing that stood out for me in that series that still does is when he's standing on top of the building. This is going to be very vague. And Bandit Cumberbatch is standing on top of the building. Benedoodle Cumber Snitch or whatever. And he's looking around and he gets a phone call that says, like, I have your friends and I'm going to shoot them. And he's like, wait a minute, who are you talking about? And he has to actually think through critically the fact he has friends and who these friends may be. And then upon like half a minute of insight of sort of investigating this topic, he realizes, oh yeah, Lestrade's my friend. This person's my friend. I actually have 4 or 5 friends. There's actually something critically important in this moment for me, and that I have to respond in a way that preserves their life and doesn't just advance my logic. And so he's brought back down right to the ordinary human level of somebody using logica utens or intuitive reasoning like anybody else, not logica docens, which is formal philosophical reasoning. And so the reason this is important is because when we're talking about clarity, we often glorify and glamorize the Russell Sherlock Holmes approach of using logica docens. In other words, we glamorize the idea of deducing things from formal logic and not of differentiating our own intuitions and our own values from what could be gleaned by observing the world and then building them from there. So he's saying, so Peirce wants to differentiate clarity based on how good we are at understanding the world. Now, he's saying the ordinary understanding of the world, in which he talks about how our habit has the same bearing as our action, our belief is our habit, our conception is our belief. We want that to be the case. But in the ordinary understanding of the world, we have this subjective feeling of mastery or clarity of apprehension that isn't actually that at all. And this goes right back to Darwin. It's not just, folk logic that, oh, I feel like I know this really well, therefore I do understand this, or I understand the nature of this. Like, I understand what kind of thing it is. It's actually a lot of philosophers and a lot of really high-level scientific thinkers use this ordinary logic, this subjective feeling of mastery. Like, humans are the rational animal. Therefore, we have a capacity to control our identities and our destiny. And we know that we're these beings that came to be the way we are through sexual and natural selection. And so it's like, but you're not looking into what people are actually going to be doing in the process of making these heavy claims. So he's like, so then you have the second grade of clarity, which is what the logicians bring in, which is what the actual people deducing things bring in, or the kind of fake Sherlock Holmes, which is the notion of distinctness. Yeah. So suddenly you are able to say that you can use a modus ponens or modus tollens formulation of if P then Q, P therefore Q. And the difficulty with this is you can plug any value into P and Q. I'm being a bit.
Can we dumb this down a little bit?
Okay, so I'm not think we need to dumb anything down. I think the audience is like really smart, but I also think that this is just getting.
Oh, the audience is smart. I'm legitimately saying for me.
Yeah. This is so technical. It's so damn technical that even my attempt to make it not technical is boring and technical. But then you have the second thing of deductive logic, so it's math, right?
Yeah.
And basically the idea that, so you're not thinking, well, I think I know it, so I know it. Now you're getting into what's called the formalities of logic, where basically, you do some math and you're like, this is definitely the case. But the difficulty with that is that distinctness, that belief, comes from this presupposition. We create the formula, we plug in the values, we derive a conclusion. So we're still kind of the slaves of our value judgments, right? In formulating those ideas. And we're not going organically based on where our doubts are actually coming from. We're memorizing things because in the end of the day, we're not going to follow the logician's logic. We're going to be memorizing the formulas. Yes, that looks like a modus tollens. Therefore, that's a correct argument form. Therefore, I should believe it. Okay, done. And that becomes as much of an established truth as autocratic truth from authority. And these two degrees of clarity, the kind of common understanding and then the mathematical or logical deduction, are things we use all the time. And they're not in any way, we shouldn't rid ourselves of them. And furthermore, we can't rid ourselves of them. But we should be aware when our conclusions are derived from the authority of a mathematical or logical system or an external authority. Like you ought to have a good Christian life and not masturbate, or a mathematical system. We should know when our beliefs are coming from an external authority. So does that kind of...
Yeah, I know that's good. And just for clarification, so people know more or less what they were following along with. Modus.
I always get these two mixed up, and like I know Shruggy's going to be probably laughing right now. Modus ponens.
Modus ponens.
Yeah, there's Modus Ponens and Modus Tollens. So Modus Ponens, I might have said Modus Tonens because I've had a little bit too much to drink potentially here.
Me too.
But Modus Ponens is P, therefore Q. So P implies Q, P therefore Q.
Hang on, I'm going to look for a model of this on Google that we can just put up.
Yeah, so this is like the classic kind of reasoning that we have in what's called sentential logic. We put a sentence into it, right?
Yeah.
I can give you an example if you want.
I found a good one actually. Hang on. You can vet it.
Okay. I can't vet a Modus Ponens. Probably should pack it in.
Yeah. Hopefully your supervisor's not watching. Here we go. How's this?
Oh God, this is terrorizing. Thanks for that Sunday. Totally. So, and you can say really weird stuff. Like, if the moon is made of blue cheese, then I will be happy. The moon is made of blue cheese, so I'm happy. Note importantly, if you say, I am happy, therefore the moon is made of blue cheese, that doesn't work because you can be happy for reasons other than the moon being made of blue cheese. But if you set the precondition, P, of the moon being made of blue cheese for your happiness, then what you're saying is your happiness is entailed by, it necessarily follows from the moon being made of blue cheese. So you got to follow it. And you got to follow it in a kind of memorized way. And a lot of philosophy undergrads love going into politicians' speeches and rhetoric and saying, oh my God, like they did so denying the antecedent or affirming the consequent are two ways of engaging in bad logic, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, they deny the antecedent, they affirm the consequent, they're using this fallacious thinking. It's because when you have this as a tool set, you feel really empowered. You're able to go into people's rhetoric and say, I don't need to be swayed by this. I need to know what's entailed by what they're saying in a deductive way. Now, most people speak through inference, which means gathering data and coming to a conclusion. But if you want to go through deduction, this is what you do. So it's a very empowering thing. And it's so empowering that prior to Peirce, everyone thought this was like the way to go, right? So that's second degree of clarity. First degree of clarity is I think I know it, so therefore I know it. Or I think I understand this thing in the world, therefore I understand it. Second one is look at this awesome modus ponens, look at what I can deduce. The third degree of clarity then is how he derives the pragmatic maxim. And so what he wants to know, he wants to create as pure a form of inquiry as is possible, where you do not go in placing in things in the P and Q sections, like Tweety is a bird or Tweety flies.
Yeah.
You have doubts about what is phenomenologically available to you, and you appease those doubts via the process of inquiry, whereby you use, there's many things for Peirce that qualify as data. I mean, even supernatural phenomena theoretically could qualify as data. He's not a sensualist. He's not interested in sensorial data, like the senses, things that can be gotten through the five senses. He's willing to account for a number of things in terms of what can go into it. So basically, he's looking into it, and he's saying that he wants to know, he wants to be able to derive the appeasement of the doubt that is itched when he can't quite come up with why something's the case by looking at the causal effects of things in the world, by observing things, not a priori, not based on an external authority, but based on what their effects in the world actually appear to be. And that's the third grade of clarity. That is the ultimately most clear way of reasoning and thinking. And the upshot of this is that you never know. There can be an end of inquiry, and he wants to imagine that there could be an end of inquiry. But the point about this is that you are never sure, and you never know. And this creates the kind of epistemic humility, or humility about what we can know, that is desperately, desperately needed, and needed now, in my opinion, more than ever. And so he derives the pragmatic maxim whereby you can understand what a thing is if you can clearly differentiate it from other things by its causal effects in the world. So what does this mean? Help me out here, Sunday, because I'm tired.
I think it means, actually, I think you made that point very clearly. I don't think we need to actually go into the meaning. I think that was actually very well put.
Yeah.
I think we've actually hit 30 seconds to an hour. So I think at this point we should just turn to the audience, see if they have any questions, and if they don't, should give you a break. I think you've been going at top speed now for quite a while. So
Yeah, well, sorry about the speed component of that.
no, this was excellent. Thank you very much. It was very lucid, actually. Do you what's the state of your earphones right now? Maybe we can take 5 seconds to.
The state of my earphones is they are partially recovered, so I can put them back in.
Yeah, give that a go.
Yeah, I did want to kind of wrap up a little bit with just one statement to try and link this back in, because otherwise we're not tying Peirce back into metaphysics, right?
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, yeah, that's a good point. So, yeah.
Which is a task you have set me, right? So basically, the long and short of this is that Peirce then looks at things like probability, where one of two or one of many outcomes could equally obtain, right? We don't know if it's going to be heads or tails over a series of coin tosses. And so as a result of this, we're not just erasing a doubt about the nature of phenomena. We don't know what the causal effect of that thing is going to be. We don't know whether the causal effect is going to be that's a tails or a heads. And this actually gets into a pretty complex mathematical set of stipulations. And so in those cases, we have to place a value, like a p-value, on various outcomes. And how we're going to do that and place a value is we're going to say we have a doubt about one set of outcomes that we want to appease by observing this. And those values can't come from authority, and they can't come from deduction or all the fancy Russell's logic or anything else. They have to come from another place. And when we're appeasing those doubts, what we're doing is we're engaging in a kind of normative science, and then we're talking about what we should do based on a phenomena. And then when we start talking about what we should do, we eventually talk about the relations between things and the kind of things that can exist in the world. And so from his reasoning in maybe what would have to be a second session, he derives this new way of looking at metaphysics. And I think the thing that I'm going to leave off on is his letter to William James. Do you remember that thing that I sent you?
Oh, shoot. I should actually bring that up. Hang on. That one I didn't manage to get to. I was too busy reading the seven grades and the first response.
So here's the thing I'm going to end off on. So he says, my dear William, I am greatly concerned to learn from Lady Willoughby that you have returned or are returning less well than you went away. So great for COVID. I have received some traces of your sojourn in Italy in a number of papers on pragmatism have been sent to me. Keep in mind that pragmatism, as he frames it, or pragmatist maxim, is that we can judge things by their causal effect, right? I'm sorry that the space at my disposal in the Modus is not sufficient to enable me to go into any branch of the subject thoroughly. This is from 1905. However, pragmatism is for me but a comparatively unimportant feature of my logic. I wish I could have a class, even an indifferently bright class, in logic for a year. I would turn out a very potent factor of science. For instance, had my logic been understood, people never could have imagined that there's any proof of the natural selection hypothesis, and eugenics that follows it. And if this had been seen, the disproofs of it would have received attention. An immense deal of futile thought about all sorts of subjects, sociology, for example, would have been guarded against. I've confidently said for 13 years that species must have risen suddenly. The mutation theory, as well as I can make out, says no more at present, because he's observing the causal effects of what's going on. And if so, it must be right, as far as it's erased his doubt. Probably these mutations are favored by insufficient nutrition and particularly affect the parts of the organism that are overworked. My logical lectures, if I had a class, would illustrate by more detailed actual examples in the history of science and any other system that has ever approached giving. It's taken over 15 years for me to work this out. This is also important because this stuff takes a lot of time, right? Like it takes a lot of time to do this. I do not draw upon psychology for a single proposition. But of course, I do not deny that some of my premises may be properly considered psychical. I've lately been writing out the application of my philosophy to religion. On the theistic question, my attitude is some semblance to that of Johnson Fox. He never actually produced this. He died. I hope to hear good news of you. My brother Herbert promised me a consulate in India, but it seems he'd been talked out of it. So he wrote to William James and told him this. And the thing about Peirce is that he never got a chance, right? And so we see now that I had come up with this whole thing about how Peirce is going against the naturalist and people who think that there's metaphysical things we can understand without really without really going into the process of inquiry, or that we can foreclose things as from authority or from deduction, and we can just understand that we're this type of being that evolved in this way and has these rational capacities, and that seemed to go against what Peirce was saying. this is actually kind of proof that the natural selection hypothesis goes against what Peirce is saying, because Peirce says it goes against what Peirce is saying. Just like my proof that Darwin cared about God and justifying his system in relation to God, the proof is that Darwin said he cared about God.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is, if you just read them, they're saying it directly. Anyway, that's it. I can't do it anymore.
Well, thank you very much. So actually, pursuant to that last point, Lily Voigt, I'm going very out of order, just this is very apropos. Lily Voidtooth asks, what are the best books to begin learning Charles Sanders Peirce? And this is actually an easy question to answer because there's very few options available right now.
Yeah, he barely published. Well, he didn't publish, and so we've been collecting his writing like literally for years. The Essential Peirce, edited by Nathan Hooser.
Here, come a bit closer.
Sorry, The Essential Peirce, edited by Nathan Hooser and Christian Klosel. That's going to be where you want to go. That's the volume that was displayed during the stream. I'm
gonna put it up again.
Yeah.
And then while I'm doing that, Noah Watson asks, do you think that eugenics is only wrong practically, or is it wrong fundamentally? And I'm not entirely clear what he means by these, so maybe we can interpret that a little bit. But
I think I get what he's saying. I mean, I think it's a really good question. Whether it's wrong in principle to try and control for who can reproduce, or whether it's just wrong in practice. I think it's wrong in principle because at the end of the day, like, as some of my friends would say, I'm just a big liberal cock. So basically, people have agential control over their outcomes. And if you think about the fact that eugenics is meant to be mankind, quote unquote, controlling its own destiny, individual people who count as humans or people, or what they would antiquatedly call men, should also be able to control that. And so given that eugenics is some external authority deciding for people who should reproduce and why, I think that's morally wrong on its own system. So I'd have to say that in the first place and fundamentally, it's wrong according to its own logic. So I would say in the first place, it's wrong, not just practically.
That's an interesting, I've never heard that argument before, but that's actually interesting.
Yeah, I'm fairly left-leaning that way. So yeah.
No, but I haven't heard that from a left-leaning person either. That's actually a really interesting way to put it. I haven't heard an argument from within sort of the ideological underpinnings of eugenics against eugenics in practice. That's interesting.
Yeah, I can't remember that now. I should think about more.
Yeah, definitely. We'll see when that guy who timestamps everything what he has to say about that.
Oh, he's awesome.
I love that guy. He should. I don't know if he's paid for it, but he should be.
Yeah.
I was going to add something else, and it's. I'm not sure if I just lost it, but
well, it's about like that. It's fundamentally wrong on its own logic as well. So it's not just.
I was going to say in addition, like just my own thought on it before you said that, because that's actually, I mean, just at first blush, that's a pretty compelling argument, I think. But I was going to say in addition to that, it also eugenics in practice, and I'm talking out of my ass a little bit here, but it seems to me like it would sort of it would cultivate a very callous attitude towards other human beings as more or less botched. Yeah, and
here's the thing. Sorry.
No, go on, please.
You can talk about what types of beings people are, and we're not denying that. We're not denying that there are real things in the world, but there's a huge far cry, and this is a whole other video, basically, about the difference between that and actual essentialism, right? That we act in accordance to some kind of essence is in no way identical to the claim that there are real things or we have actual qualities that we can't really change, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would say that eugenics is fundamentally essentialist, and right. That's why I don't like it.
And I'd also say that like very few people actually use the word eugenics in a positive sense. I mean, of course, in its initial use, it was meant to be a positive term. It's in the word. It's good genes, Greek for good.
Yep.
So yeah.
Eudaimonia, right? Eugenics and eudaimonia. It's the same.
Exactly. Yeah. It's eudaimonia by way of eugenics.
Actually, that's very clever. Yeah, I agree with
that. But when people bring it up today, sort of, we're in sort of the post-history of eugenics being used in that positive sense. Now it has a great stigma about it, and for very good reason. But when it's deployed today, it's to describe sort of tendencies that we that we now associate with eugenics movements, towards using genetics as not just as a tool, but also as an alibi for basically intergroup bigotry.
Yes.
Yeah. And so there's like, yeah, sorry, go on, please. And should I just wrap that up quickly? So there's, of course, you'll hear rhetoric around race and IQ frequently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my thing about race and IQ, like I've never had a chance to actually address this or talk about this. And race is a pseudoscientific term that differentiates people according to essential properties that loosely correspond to geographical origin and kind of assume cultural norms that aren't really there. And so what we'd say is if you looked into a person and you look about what made them who they were, their ethnic identification, their cultural norms, the things that matter to them as a person are likely going to impact who they are to a more substantial extent than whatever sort of geographical phenotype we can place them into. The other bizarre thing about the way race functions in a lot of people's rhetoric when they're being sort of like interested in things like racial homogeny and that kind of thing is that they assume that one type of person inhabits one geographic region. So I grew up in a diverse community where people, I associate and identify with people of a quote unquote race very different than my own. Like my best friend who is actually just, frustrates the hell out of me because he's incredibly similar to me. He's incredibly similar to me in habit, in history, in behavior, in consciousness, even in his soul to some extent. And he's a different technical race than I am.
Hang on just a second. I think you've got some volume in the background there, maybe.
Yeah, I do. I might just have to mute it for a second.
I just don't want you to dox yourself.
No, I'm definitely not. Yeah, I'm definitely going to just mute.
All right. Yeah, keep on asking your questions, guys, and we'll bring them up. I think we're going to probably go for about 10 to 15 more minutes. Depends on Djalma, of course. We'll get their opinion on that in due time, I think. So if you've asked your questions and they're higher up in the queue, please copy and paste them down further so I don't miss them. I'm very bad at that. I try, but I'm still learning the ropes here, so I'll appreciate your patience. And if you have any questions for me, by all means ask while we're waiting, because that's fine. Daniel Adrian, I will actually ask Djalma about the name. I have a sense of where it comes from, but the particulars do evade me a little bit. I do think it has to do with the off the top of my head. I think it's sort of a loose anagram of Juna Barnes, who, if I recall correctly, was a student of T.S. Eliot and wrote a modernist novel called Nightwood, which is actually fairly good, so I could recommend that. Having only read a fragment of it, unfortunately, to my great shame. Oh,
I've mildly switched locations. I've been kind of listening in. So what I was going to say is, like, I'm actually happy to take questions for another half hour or so if you have the energy. I mean, I love.
Well, I think an hour and a half is probably a good place to end up. So let's say 17 minutes, and if we go a bit over, that's fine.
Okay. But yeah, so due to my extrovert nature, though, I do enjoy that. I just, had to cave after about an hour of talking before that.
Yeah, why the hell am I the one with the channel here? This doesn't make any sense. All right.
So yeah, my name does actually come from Juna Barnes, and the reason I'm so obsessed with Juna Barnes is I actually did my first one of my master's degrees in Juna Barnes, and I talked a lot about inversion in the interwar period because I was I basically would have become like a literary modernist, so studying like Hemingway and those kind of people, but I switched into philosophy because it just seemed like a less impoverished discipline from a number of perspectives. I'm sure that Sunday can talk to that a little bit in some future case, but yeah, it comes from Juna Barnes, and basically the first name is this Turkish or something warrior that she based her first name off of, and I was just trying to be kind of clever about it. And the last name is like, it means, I forget what the two names mean together. I often come up with things, I'm like, oh, that's so clever, and then I forget what I did 2 weeks later. So yeah, it's loosely based on that.
Okay. Okay, will the fan base get a live stream? That's for me, obviously. Yeah, hopefully. Or you mean just like a Q&A kind of thing for the channel? Yeah, I'm thinking of that. I'm also thinking of that because I do have, I already have 2 patrons, which is kind of amazing. So we'll have to find a way to reward them somehow because, especially right now, anybody willing to support this channel deserves as much attention as they can get, and I'm open to suggestions as well. But yeah, if enough people ask for it, I'll definitely do a live stream for just regular audience members to come in and chat if they want. Shruggy asked, what about the you'll be able to understand this question more than me. What about the method of quote unquote la 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 I'm not listening? Peirce actually countenances something like this in his essay, The Fixation of Belief, but perhaps it's politically relevant now. Do you have anything to say to that?
I'm trying to I always mix up early Peirce in terms of the fixation of belief and how to make our ideas clear. In general, I think what Peirce would say is that there's some people who are so used to adhering to authority, or what external authority has to say on some topic, that they're actually kind of incapable of actually pursuing a line of inquiry in a way that would force them to just sort of purely look at erasing their doubts via looking at the causal effects of things. Like, they just absolutely are inculcated against doing that because they spent so much time fixing their beliefs in inappropriate ways that kind of appeal to authorities.
Here, come a bit closer. You're drifting away again.
Sorry, yeah. They spend so much time appealing to authority and fixing their beliefs that they basically are no longer able to engage in the process of inquiry. So he fears that, and he fears that autocratic tendency, and he hates authoritarianism. Like, he really, really hates it. And he thinks that authoritarian thinking can really grip people at the level of their consciousness. And I think he thinks that's an example of that.
Horizonberg asks, what about allowing parents to voluntarily create designer babies? Would that be eugenics or something else?
I was hoping someone would ask this. This is one of my little things. Basically, that's something that we would call epigenetics. And so eugenics and epigenetics are non-identical. It's a really good question, but they're often reduced to each other. And eugenics has to do with a historical practice that, thank God, is largely gone now, which basically is this authoritarian establishing of what types of people should reproduce or not. And you can get very conspiratorial with that. I know a lot of people have gotten conspiratorial around conception in that question, like contraceptive pills, pardon me, and that question. So there's a lot of conspiracy around what is eugenics. But epigenetics is basically that it's a kind of transhumanism. And it's this idea that we ought to be able to pick for certain qualities in our children, or that we ought to be able to modify them such that they meet certain ideals. And it follows the same logic of eugenics sometimes. Like, there's people this is a very contentious point, but there's people in the community of people who are not visually impaired people who basically will say that, well, that's a whole culture. And so if I knew my child was going to be visually impaired and I didn't encourage that, or I discouraged that, or I encouraged something else instead, I would be denying them cultural access to that. And there's all kinds of contention around that, and like, obviously, right? But at minimum, that shows kind of the tension in a lot of epigenetic claims. It's like, yeah, you have the right to do that. Do you have the right to do that over an emergent life? Do you have the right to kind of structure what they're going to be like by picking certain traits and not other traits? And that's a, generally speaking, different set of concerns and questions. Gregor Wolbring at University of Alberta, I think, goes over a lot of that.
Can you say the name again?
Gregor Wolbring talks about this a lot. So Gregor, and then last name Wolbrig. We can put
Wolbrig.
Yeah. And he has this like group of researchers.
Here, come a bit closer again. As you drift away, like your audio just kind of fizzles out.
Oh, sorry. There's this group of researchers that he works with, and he kind of talks about that too. So basically, he has a certain political perspective on it, but basically, epigenetics is different than eugenics insofar as epigenetics is about picking traits, and eugenics is about who ought to reproduce according to some authority.
And I guess you would you say also that eugenics has to sort of implicate a kind of a long-term historical viewpoint of the group or the species? Like it's not specifically concerned with the individual. Like clearly, a parent who wants a quote-unquote designer baby, they want that baby for the sake of the baby having certain qualities. Their concern is not necessarily insofar as they want a designer child, the future of the race or something along those lines.
Exactly. And, their concerns can play into that. It's like, well, I think that X trait is superior and superior genetically, and therefore I want to encourage it. It can definitely play into that rhetoric. But in the first place, it's not so much about controlling the destiny of mankind as rational beings via taking control of the process of natural selection. And it's more about what traits do I want? Like, what do I want to see, and why do I want to see them? And so there's ethical concerns with that too, but they're different ethical concerns than for eugenics. Yeah.
There was a good question here. Let me see if I can find it. I've lost it. Not to say it's a bad question, but we're going to go to this one instead. Noah Watson asks, and maybe you'll want to clarify what this term means. Do you think that if dysgenics were occurring, which people like Michael, not sure if this is, which people like Michael Woodley argue is the case, would intervention to stop that be justified, or would it still be immoral?
Okay, so I don't really know what dysgenics is.
I'm going to Google that really quickly just so we know. Noah Watson, if you want to clarify, by all means. Oh, here we go. So it's right on Google. Dysgenic, exerting a detrimental effect on later generations through the inheritance of undesirable characteristics. So I mean, if you wanted to sanitize that and take like sort of the politics out of it, you could say congenital diseases. Like
what's even less contentious and possibly more interesting is the idea of psychopathy. So let's say that I think congenital diseases could be cultures, and you can get this whole, I'm
thinking more of like something along the lines of
but let's imagine a thought experiment where the world, and this may actually be the case, is getting largely more psychopathic. And let's say they're getting circumstantially psychopathic, but for whatever reason, we believe in evolutionary psychology, and we think this is a possibly inheritable thing. In that instance, in the instance of people getting more psychopathic and wanting to guard against that by encouraging psychopaths not to reproduce, you'd have to have this kind of, the problem is you're going to have to defeat any kind of Kantian notion of personhood or moral agency in order to say that a certain type of person should not be allowed to reproduce. And this is actually a serious question when it comes to like prisoners who get let out of prison. And there's a lot of, especially in right-leaning circles, like thinking about this topic, right? But in general, you're going to have to deal with the agency problem, and you're going to have to deal with the fact that you are policing morally in the first place as a background belief that this is a kind of being that ought not to exist. And the danger with that is that we're not these static essential beings. We can change. We are behaviorally complex. And when you start moralizing one being, I don't want to evoke a slippery slope, but there is a bit of a slippery slope fallacy going on here, because then you start to have to moralize generally. And the more autocratic, authoritarian moralizing you're doing, the more likely you are to slip up. And if you slip up, what's at stake? Someone's ability to reproduce, someone's ability to engage in potentially one of the most fundamental human activities. So I'm going to say that no, even in dysgenics, I don't think it's mandated, and I don't think it's right for that reason.
Although certainly, like again, going back to like the question about designer babies and whatnot, if you're talking about like an individual family or an individual or just an individual choosing not to have children on the grounds that they have some crippling disorder and they don't want somebody else to experience that is not in itself eugenics.
No, it isn't.
Yeah, that's something else.
You're not preventing someone from reproducing. You're making a moral decision about the status of the being you're bringing into the world that has its own complexities associated with it, but it's not quite the same thing.
Now, by contrast, people, for example, who don't want people with Down syndrome to reproduce, that is eugenics.
I would say so, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. sort of change gears a little bit. Locke's Logos asks, what are some good books to learn metaphysics for rookies?
Okay.
I mean, if maybe you should. I mean,
No,
as a rookie myself, good luck.
You know what I'd honestly say? I would say that even Peirce looks up to Aristotle and believes that Aristotle is one of the finest metaphysicians because he accounts for things not in just in actu, as he frames it, so in ACTUU, or like in existence that are in the world, as many 18th, 19th century philosophers do. They just focus on things in the world, things you can understand through necessary entailment, things you can understand empirically, blah, blah. But he looks at things like what Peirce calls esse in potentia, so things that could exist. So Aristotle has the most subtle metaphysics on Peirce's view of any thinker since then, and also is the most sort of Aristotle's metaphysics are the most instructive in terms of how one ought to reason through non-equivalent categories of being. Because the second you get into metaphysics, you get into things like nominalism versus realism. So whether things are the way they are because we named them that way, or because they have some kind of, quotes, real existence outside of us. You get into like a variety of different philosophical traditions. And so because Aristotle has the greatest ability to account for different categories of reality simultaneously, he would usually be the reference point. So I would say Aristotle's metaphysics would be an excellent place to start.
Do you recommend anything as sort of a precursor to the metaphysics, or do you think it's okay just to jump
I think you
into
should
that?
just start right with the metaphysics, and you would get in fairly far, fairly quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good for me too, actually, because I've been wondering about that.
Mm-hmm.
I've only read Aristotle's political writings. I've started the physics, which is useful, but Aristotle too, he tends to sort of set down his methodology in every text that he does. So you almost learn the rest of Aristotle's corpus through any one part, with exceptions, of course. But you understand Aristotle broadly by studying little bits of him very, very quickly, I found. Granted, that's in the political stuff, so it's probably a bit easier.
And the difficulty with Aristotle is, like, because he influenced us so profoundly, it's very easy to assume that that's because of the quality of content of what he's produced, rather than just that we reference him, right? So we exist in a post-Aristotelian world, largely speaking, right?
Yeah.
Which is a statement of fact more than a value statement. Just as a caveat. That being said, he's got really good reality ideas.
Yeah, which is again not to say that Aristotle is not extremely useful and interesting and good generally. Just that, I mean, I even in my lowly position as a political scientist, I have no truck with people who say we just need to go back to Aristotle and that's that, as if philosophy was settled with the scholastics.
Well, I mean, it's kind of an overdetermined claim, right? So it's saying that, like, on the one hand, we could get some really important insight just on the face of it from Aristotle. On the flip side, we could trace our intellectual traditions very successfully to Aristotle without going wrong. So it's like, pick your poison.
Yeah. Just looking for some more questions here. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, we're just going to keep going, I think, until we lose.
I mean, I'm good to keep going, like, until one of us collapses. Like, it may not be me, haha.
Oh yeah, well, thank God I'm not a more active participant in this, because I'm so wiped today.
I'm really wiped out too. I'm not going to lie, but I am fine for like 15 minutes or so.
Well, we're definitely going to come back on, so that's
awesome. Thank you.
It will continue again. Yeah, I will deign to give you a second shot at this.
It would be a blessing indeed. I just need I'm getting more alcohol.
Yeah. Yeah, if there's no more questions, I think we can probably just wrap it up. Maybe so thank you very much, Djalma, for coming on. That was really interesting. I'm really looking forward to seeing if what's his name? I can't remember his name. The guy who does the timestamps. I'm curious to see if he can keep up with this. I know it was one that he just gave up.
Michael Pisarino, I think.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for having me. It was really lovely, and a great conversation, I think, and hopefully people got something out of it.
No, my pleasure. It's probably some of the most interesting content that we've had on here by far. It's helped me a lot out. I'm hoping I don't have to revise my nationalism part 2 video now, because that's already taken 3+ weeks and I'm dying. So Oh, here we go. One last
I mean,
question.
Purse would be happy for you to revise it and then be hand-wringing about that too. It's a very obsessive process, as you can see. I think
do you want to take one? Do you want to take two more questions? Because there's two more here that are kind of interesting.
I'd be happy to. And like, again, like I know I've gone through things quickly and like, I hope it's been interesting and not just totally weird. So yeah, I'm happy.
All right. Okay. So keep asking questions, guys. We got 3 now. So we'll screw it. We'll just keep going.
Yeah.
So Noah Watson asks, this is sort of related to an earlier question. Do you think that eugenics is bad only in the case of direct restriction, or are soft pressures that discourage reproduction equally as bad? I think, just to sort of preempt you there, I think your argument was more or less against eugenics simpliciter. It wasn't against how it was sort of being deployed, right?
Yeah, and I actually say that in some ways, I'm a big fan of direct evil. I think that, and this goes back to some like weird kind of incidental interest in Zizek. You know, Zizek provides an example in some of his, I don't know, like some of his post-Lacanian psychologistic thinking, and that's not to insult it, where he talks about like, you know, the problem with bosses and employees now is like the boss is always trying to invoke your personal life and like wrap your personal concerns into his otherwise public considerations of you. So it's not like, you know, how you don't just get told when to show up at work. You don't just get told when to leave work.
Yeah.
You get asked if you like, you know, had a good night last night with your partner. And the response is yes, and you have to divulge that personal information. And then he tells you he's going to fire you. So he forces everything out of you, and then in this way of pretending to be your friend, and then indirectly tells you he's going to fire you. To someone like Zizek, it's much better if he just came up to you and said, you know what, you're gone.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing works with any ideological tradition that can be used to a bad end. So a lot of what happened was when people went... when Harry Benjamin, who was not explicitly a eugenicist by any means, even if Havelock Ellis arguably was, would conduct transsexual surgeries on people, it would just be a fact that they were infertile. And they often didn't know this. And he'd be like, oh yeah, sorry, I didn't give you those options. We don't really know what to do anyway. Another more insidious example is that often First Nations people in Western Canada would be, in the 1960s and 70s, taken in to check for their parental... their aptness as parents or their ability to parent. And they'd be given all kinds of tests and all kinds of things that would be, in this case, actually genuinely rigged. And the results would be rigged. And they'd say, oh, you know, it looks like you're not fit to parent, but don't worry about it. And then maybe they would retain their children, but they go for a routine medical checkup 2 weeks later and find out that while they were sterilized against their will.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because one of the things that I'm actually touching on in my video, or at least research, I don't know if I'll bring it up, but I was looking into the sort of some of the legislation in the African colonies, I think in the last century, and one of the ways in which, I don't know how far to get into this because I still have only a loose grasp of it, but basically they use things like like the polygamy issue, which was hardly ever manifest in actual practice. I think of like the thousands of Indians in the African colonies, only about 40 cases of polygamy were actually present at a given time.
And then, of course, the judgment that polygamy is bad, or polygamy doesn't fit into any other more complex
well, here was
agricultural system, right?
Yeah. Well, here was the crucial thing. That was deployed specifically as a way to disallow Indian elites from consolidating their families in the colonies, because Indian elites provided a framework for upward mobility for other Indian migrants, which would cause them to solidify their presence in the region. So in this way, legislation itself had a eugenic quality in that they were specifically trying to control for the proliferation of Indian-born people.
It certainly did, and even in like I have a little bit of background, like the War of No Pity in like 1857, and sort of the demonization of Nana Sahib and everything in that process. You know, I'm not as up on that as I could be, but that was also to the end of ensuring that people didn't see what was going on in terms of race mixing or upper mobility among different groups, or through reproduction or anything like that, by demonizing somebody as, quote, dark-skinned and then making somebody who was light-skinned angelic. The one thing I will mention about like First Nations, the forced sterilization of First Nations people, is that, you know, people say that, oh, you're equivocating between cultural genocide and actual genocide. I mean, that's pretty close to being actually genocidal at that juncture. It's about the most evil thing you could do to somebody.
Well, it's actually specifically targeting the genes in isolation. That's the interesting thing. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's genocide in the most literal sense possible. It's not even saying they're
Yeah.
trying to wipe out a people. They're actually trying to wipe out the genes.
And that's covert. And so, you know what? Give me direct evil because I can interface with it. Not that it's better, but aesthetically, I prefer it.
Yeah.
I don't like evil, period. But yeah.
You've watched The Lighthouse already, right?
I have not. No, I'm actually scared to in quarantine.
Okay, but anyways, like you've seen clips of it though, because I've sent them to you. But you know, in
Yes.
like when shoot, what's his name? When Robert Pattinson first arrives on the island, and he's sort of being told what to do by his new boss, Willem Dafoe. The old lighthouse keeper who's played by Willem Dafoe is like, go, you're not swabbing this properly. Go back to work, you lazy dog. Things like that.
Yeah.
And that was less creepy than later on when they started to get friendly. And
Oh, totally.
yeah,
Because here's the thing, I believe Zizek on this, which is like everyone's gonna like make fun of me for this, but which is basically that you have to give more for what you're getting back, right? Because you suddenly have to give out personal existential information, or you're doing something else that leads back horribly to the original outcome anyway. You're not able to actually put a barrier between yourself and your boss, enemy, interlocutor, the evil surgeon who's trying to do horrible things to you. You're not able to actually retain anything of yourself. You're forced to give increasing amounts of yourself because it's being done in a covert way. It sucks. Like, it really sucks.
And it abuses your goodwill. So this person who has power over you, who may be abusing their power over you, you're now being more or less duped into treating like a kindly uncle or something. It's really disturbing.
It is. And in fact, that's why you should do your videos on the different types of evil, because it's that kind of pleasant, like smiling evil, right? That like pleasant, anyway.
Yeah.
Ugh, I hate it. Okay.
Okay, that was one question. Let's move on.
We can be more efficient, don't worry.
What does Djalma think of the claim that pragmatism is an approach?
Okay. Who is that?
That's from Daniel Adrian.
Pragmatism is an approach. And it's an approach, so the thing about pragmatism is that Peirce's pragmaticism, because he has to be extra fancy, is the original way of construing pragmatism as a subdisciplinary approach. And pragmatism is basically that we're not going to focus on the truth value of something. We're going to adjudicate it and evaluate it, like give it value based on its causal effects. And so it is, of course, an approach. And I think that's a really good way of putting it, because I think that inquiry itself, that leads the pragmatic maxim of judging things by the causal effects, or some of the more complex iterations that he produces later on, involve approaching the world in a specific fashion methodologically to achieve an outcome. Because keep in mind that philosophy is not just about knowing things. It's about doing things in a specific way. It's about, using the right weapon for the right battle, right? And maybe not knowing what that is ahead of time in an a priori way, but maybe figuring out through the process of inquiry. So it is an approach, and it is a methodology, as well as being a way of gaining the most clarity about some issue. So I'd say that's a correct way of framing it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know I have. I don't know anything about this. I somehow doubt you do, but the last man asks, "What do you make of JF's Revolutionary Phenotype book?" That's Jean-François Garepi, if I know the name. Yeah, I haven't read anything by JF. I don't know. I know that I've seen him in streams, and he seems kind of like a nutball.
I can tell you why
yeah, go on, please.
I can tell you why the title annoys me.
Oh, that would be great.
The title annoys me because the idea that you could psychologistically or phenotypically possess any trait that wasn't cultivated carefully and relationally via your behavior and habituation over a lifetime is really arrogant and really annoys me. And also, humans are really flawed. And so if that's what that title means, I don't like it.
I just don't like JF.
Yeah, I don't even know them, so.
Yeah, he had a discussion with Vosh recently, and it was just embarrassing.
Ugh.
He's just weird. I'm going to take this one because this is my area. So Plumber Trap asks, actually, well, you know this too. Actually, didn't the Spartans practice a form of eugenics? And I assume he's referring to the killing of sickly babies. or by exposure. Again, no. In fact, they couldn't have, for the simple reason that they didn't have a concept of genes. That is one thing that eugenics, and this is one of the reasons, again, why, as we were talking about earlier, designer babies as such aren't inherently. It's not inherently eugenic practice, although it can be performed. The creation of designer babies can be performed for eugenic motives, because the bare fact of selecting in individual cases for positive traits as to whether or not you bring the thing to fruition does not itself implicate the genetic group as such, thought of as a genetic group. So the Spartans didn't engage in eugenics per se. They didn't engage in a practice that eugenics could very much make use of.
Could I make I'm just going to add an addendum to that too, which is the Spartans are weeding people out according to perceived behavioral traits they think might track something about them. Like, they behave in weak ways, therefore they must be weak. And
well, I think in this case, I mean, I don't actually know the details of this too deeply, but like, just the practice of child exposure is very common in the ancient world, and that specifically, you're looking again specifically at the infant form itself.
Exactly.
So, yeah, like, again, it's at the level of the. I'm not sure of the correct language for this, but it's at the it's. What would you call it if it implicates the body over the genes? What would that be called?
I mean, it sounds like materialism or something. I don't know if there's a word for that. All I know is that, if I'm being quite literal and basic about it, that it's not tracking the reproductive capacities of babies. It's noting the behavior in babies that are seen as unfit to participate as Spartans and eliminating them via this violent process. So even then it's a different activity. But same kind of weirdness, definitely.
I'll actually have to look into that one again, because I'm actually a bit unclear on that. And I mean, they did, of course, have a conception, as everybody did, that traits did pass down by family. But again, the question is, how and to what end? Genes, like the concept of genes, carries more particularity than just heredity.
Yeah, and I think also it's important to remember, even moving a step out from hereditary traits and genes, is that you're tracking a behavior in that case. It really does seem like, versus tracking an essence. Yeah. You're not saying like this being has this essence. You're saying, I don't like its father or its lineage, or there's something off about this. I don't want this person to exist. That's a different kind of sentiment than talking about the essence of a type of being, than talking about a congenital invert like Count Sandor or something, right? Yeah.
Okay, I think that was all the questions. Unless I've missed one, I'm just scrolling up quickly. But I think we're at an hour and 42 minutes. So I think we can probably
call it.
Thanks everybody for taking part and asking questions and watching, of course. And again, thank you very much, Djalma, for an extremely interesting hour and a half.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's been really great, and hopefully we will do something again soon.
Yeah, definitely. So thanks everybody, and take care.